I'm pleased now to introduce Andres Bernal. Andres is an educator, organizer, and scholar interested in the intersection of human well-being with social transformation. His research at the New School for Public Engagement looks at the political economy and social narratives of the Green New Deal. Andres was an advisor to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez during her 2018 congressional campaign and continues to work with her team on the organizing and policy design at the core of the Congresswoman's progressive agenda. He is a first-generation immigrant to the United States from Bogota, Colombia, and was raised in the Rio Grande Valley, Texas.
Okay, I want to quickly thank everybody for coming out here. I want to thank Stanley and all of the organizers, DSA. Thank you all for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here in Bridgeport. It's actually my first time here, so lovely to be here. About a year and a half ago, I was working on my doctoral studies, thinking that maybe 5 years from then I would like to get more involved in activism, maybe speak a little more on things, and just kind of hanging out in New York City. Occasionally I would get together for drinks or coffee with a good friend of mine named Alexandria, and we would talk about, life and needing to make big changes to the world. And in 2016, Donald Trump got elected, and it kind of just threw us all in a whirlwind and a bit of a panic. And I remember that my friend said that she felt like she had a bigger purpose in life, that she had something big to do. She didn't quite know what it was. We had kind of speculated and tried to maybe do a podcast and things like that, but nothing really came together. And then one day she decided to go to Standing Rock because of the crisis that was happening over there. So she took a trip to Standing Rock and she did a live stream on Facebook about it. She took a trip with some of her friends, and on her way back, she had told me that she had a very spiritual experience over there, and it was on her way back that she received a call from Justice Democrats that they felt that she would be a good person to run for office, and she was completely taken by surprise by this. So she then set off on this journey that at the time seemed absolutely crazy. And when I first heard about it, I was very excited, but I also thought, it's going to be an uphill struggle, to say the least, because of course she was challenging the third most powerful Democrat in the House, a 30-year incumbent, somebody that basically ran the political machine in Queens. How the hell was this 28-year-old going to pull this off? And around this month last year, I began to actually think that she might actually win this thing. And it was because a group of very passionate people in the community and around the community really saw something powerful in her message and what she was trying to accomplish. We also saw that she was bringing together two really important messages that oftentimes get separated or antagonized, which is the importance of having voices from people that are traditionally marginalized, such as women, young people, people of color, etc., and also a message that focuses on class and on working people who are getting screwed over by the system as it is. So all of these people started this grassroots movement and went out, knocked on doors, got to know their neighbors, told them about the campaign. There wasn't really, interestingly enough, there wasn't a lot of ideology behind the campaign. It was just kind of this common sense notion that something is wrong, that the people who run politics are not interested, don't have the best interests of the people that work there in mind. Joe Crowley didn't even live in the district, didn't send his kids to the public schools in the district either. And there was this kind of total detachment from those that are in power, and in particular Joe Crowley in that district and the rest of the people. And so this caught on. It seemed kind of common sense and started kind of this energy that was getting stronger and stronger the closer that we got to the primary. And then of course she went on The Intercept around this time last year and started talking about wanting to abolish ICE and all of these big agendas, right? Medicare for all, that it wasn't, she started pointing out that this was just common sense. It didn't have to be seen as this radical idea, that people actually liked it. Bringing up climate change in an era when we were just, our conversation around the climate was absolutely dismal. started getting more and more popular, released the campaign video that went viral. And that's kind of when I knew she's going to win this thing. And I would recommend that on May 1st, all of you watch, if you can, on Netflix, the documentary that follows her campaign, because it's absolutely amazing. So I learned a lot from that experience. I had a very life-changing experience from that, and here I am now today, and I find myself speaking about several things now. Never thought I would be in this situation at this point, but I think there's a very powerful message in all of this. So what was my role in her campaign? Well, as she was kind of growing in popularity, I decided that it would be important to take the things that I was studying at the time, researching, particularly around political economy, macroeconomics, and democratizing workplaces. I was very interested in worker cooperatives. And in my research, I was finding that a lot of time these efforts to build out more worker enterprises were getting really stifled because of access to capital, to money, for money and investment to actually make these things grow. So it was kind of like little pockets here and there in smaller marginalized industries here and there. So my thinking started to move towards how can we make this more of a general policy agenda? This, of course, later got connected to the environmental crisis and whatnot. But with Alexandria, I was getting more and more into this idea of a federal jobs guarantee. I used to be like a universal basic income person, and I was convinced by some colleagues and some friends, particularly work around Bernie Sanders' chief economist, Stephanie Kelton, who was pushing forward this idea of a federal jobs guarantee. So that kind of brought me on board, and so I went to Alexandria and I said, look, I think you should consider this idea because dignified labor and a job should be a right, and on top of that, this agenda, and I'll speak more about this a little later, actually will stabilize the economy too. So she put it on her platform, and it ended up becoming the most popular thing on her platform in her district, more than Medicare for All. People really, really love this federal jobs guarantee idea. So from there, we started working together on building relationships and conversations around how to reject some of the mainstream economic ideas that have kind of brainwashed the culture, completely taken over the Democratic Party since the 70s. Because no Democrat today can talk about anything without implicitly accepting all of these conservative right-wing assumptions about how the economy works. And sometimes even leftists too. So that's kind of the work that I was doing there. So where are we now? We're talking about the Green New Deal. It's this super powerful idea. It's been able to completely take over and change the narrative as it exists. Before the Green New Deal, before Alexandria, you had Republicans who denied that climate change even existed, and then you had Democrats that basically said, well, as Richard was talking about, we'll try a tax, we'll try these little market incentives here and there, maybe we'll invest in entrepreneurship or something like that. And nobody really talked about a mass mobilization to address the problem. Nobody talked about industrial policy. Nobody talked about transforming the infrastructure in the economy. And then in a couple months, this 29-year-old just starts saying some things, getting in people's faces, taking the risk to do these things, organizing around a social movement like Sunrise and DSA. And here we are. We're actually having this conversation, and we're putting forward a real non-binding resolution that sets the stage for the next decade, I think, of struggle in this country. And at the core of this, there's this idea of jobs versus sustainability. How can we improve people's living conditions, give people the income and the dignity they need to live good lives without blowing up the earth, essentially? That's where we're at. So at the core of the Green New Deal, and as many of you might know, it's a non-binding resolution. The reason it's a non-binding resolution is because it's meant to be like a holding space to get this thing going. Similar to the first New Deal, the New Deal, Roosevelt's New Deal, wasn't passed through one bill. It was a series of bills that were passed over time. So the Green New Deal is meant to kind of act as, first and foremost, setting down the terms that climate change is real, that we have to act fast, that it requires a mobilization at the scale of going to war, and that it opens up all of the space for bills to be passed under right now these 5 ideas, right? So one of them is to decarbonize the economy and have a carbon neutral economy by 2030. Another one is to create millions of jobs in this process so that we don't get caught up in this paradox like in France where they taxed, and of course consumers and workers were the ones that had to pay the price for that, and you had riots and all these kinds of things, right? So we want to create millions of jobs in the process. Number 3, we want to build out an infrastructure, a renewable infrastructure, whether that be energy-wise, food-wise, transportation-wise, housing-wise, right? What do we need in order for this economy, this renewable, low-carbon or zero-carbon economy to work? Number 4 is that, we want to reinvigorate the environmental policy that protected people by securing clean air, clean water, against all of these kind of toxic things, right? That this has kind of been environmental policy since the 70s. A lot of times it's ignored or there's no way to enforce it, right? So we want to make sure to reinvigorate that again. And then lastly, it's the idea of the just transition, right? Which is to say that the very system that is putting all this carbon dioxide into the air, that is warming up the planet and causing all this environmental destruction, is also marginalizing certain people, people of color, indigenous people, women, working people, poor people, right? It's connected. And that's one of the most powerful things about the Green New Deal, that's forcing us to see the way that these things are all connected into one kind of system. And I believe that this is the first break from neoliberalism that we've had at the mainstream level. Because before that, all we've really talked about is it's market incentives, but now we're seeing the system as a whole. So that's the idea. So where do we go from here? I think now we're seeing a kind of a reformation of the political actors involved. We've forced the Republican Party now to accept that climate change is real. They were not willing to do that. Now they accept that it's real. They have their own plans now to do whatever about it. We've forced now a lot of centrist Democrats to at least acknowledge that a Green New Deal is necessary. Now many of them want to kind of co-opt it, make it more compatible with corporate capitalism and whatnot, but they at least acknowledge that something like a Green New Deal has to happen. And then of course, we have people in the Alexandria Progressive Coalition who understand that this is a transformation of the way we live our lives and a massive mobilization, right? And I think we still have some cynics or skeptics who can even be on the left sometimes, who kind of believe unless we eliminate the profit motive tomorrow, then none of this is going to work, right? And I don't see myself as there, and I certainly don't see Alexandria or other people in the Progressive Coalition there either. We really believe that we have to do something now, and we have to also improve people's lives as soon as possible. Okay, so I think that this leaves us with an idea of non-reformist reform. Right? For me, that's very important, and that's very different from traditional reform, which kind of says we accept that the economy functions in a certain way. We're just going to tweak it a little bit here and there to make it a little bit more humane, to maybe redistribute things a little bit, but at the core, all the assumptions about the way capitalism has to work is true. I think non-reformist reform has a longer vision that says we're going to keep transforming things and improving people's lives in a larger, longer agenda over time that's meant to go somewhere else, to transcend the system as we know it now. And so I think in order to understand the non-reformist reform at the heart of the Green New Deal, it can be important to think about what's the system of the mind, the way we imagine this economy and capitalism, and how might we think about things a little differently to open space to take action, right? So of course, when we think about criticisms and critiques of capitalism, oftentimes Karl Marx comes to mind, right? And the brilliance there was to move us away from this idea that the economy is just a bunch of people trading and commerce and whatnot, and really look below that and see that you need to think about production, right? You need to create all of these things, and of course, class has a part to do in that, and workers play a role in doing that, and their labor is being exploited, and that's all accumulating at the top, right? And there's this tendency for capitalism to produce too many things and drive people's wages down, and so you don't have enough people to buy stuff anymore because all the wealth is accumulated, and then the whole thing kind of just blows up, right? Okay, I think that's really important to continue to keep in mind, but in addition to that, I like to draw from the work of philosopher Nancy Fraser, who talks about how two Karls are better than one. So in addition to Karl Marx, we also have this other guy named Karl Polanyi, right? And one of the important things about Karl Polanyi is that he presses us to think about the way that we shouldn't economize the world too much. That while there are these inner forces within the economy itself is also required to press up against other things too. In order for this wage system to maintain itself, you need all these other factors into play, right? So you need a nature or an environment that's going to offer all of these inputs into that economy indefinitely, or however much the people that need it require from it, and also serve as like this sink that gets like this trash that gets put back into it, right? So that's kind of one thing, right? Then you also have labor, which needs, 5 minutes, wow, okay. So I'll go through this really quickly. So you need a bunch of workers to get put into a wage system, but in order for those workers to work, you need a lot of unpaid wages and labor traditionally that get put on women to take care of people, to do all this kind of work that oftentimes gets ignored in our traditional analysis of capitalism. And finally, you need a legal system and a monetary system to exist, and that comes from the state. All right, so what's important about all of this is that Polanyi inspired an entire field of economic sociology to think about how we should avoid naturalizing the economy. The economy is not a natural thing that just kind of exists out there. Oftentimes we think that there are these markets that exist in nature and that the state has to intervene into it, and that's complete nonsense. Capitalism needed a state to be very active in creating this market economy, right? Thank you. And so the whole debate that we have with ourselves is oftentimes, erroneous in thinking that a state has to go in. No, the state's already acting. Even in neoliberalism, the state is very active in making things happen. We just want to transform what it's doing to work actually for people and for us. And so we have all of these boundaries that we have to kind of consider. And so I'm very interested in the boundary of public power. That is the legal system and the monetary system that has to be created in order for this economy to function. And so when thinking about the Green New Deal, I come from a tradition called modern monetary theory, and this is an interdisciplinary approach to macroeconomics, which basically goes back through history and looks at the origins of money and the role of the state in creating money, and rejects many of the orthodox economic views that in a lot of ways rationalize capitalism by saying, yeah, this is the way it happens, and actually proposes that we think about how money itself is this socially, legally constructed thing, okay? And it pushes us to understand that what's important are real resources: labor, the environment, technology, what we can do, the knowledge that we might have, and not obsess over this thing of like money, like where are we gonna get it from, right? The United States invented the dollar. It has total monopoly over the dollar. It's just a legal social construction. And the only limits to different ways that the dollar can be used or issued by the state are the limits of what's available in terms of real resources. Are there people to do the work? Do we have the technology to do the work? And do we have like the real material things to do the work, right? So my role in the Green New Deal has been to advocate for the notion that we can move away, especially because of the urgency of the situation, we can move away from the idea that we have to find the money somewhere. Right? In any progressive agenda, whether it's Medicare for all, universal higher education, the Green New Deal, progressives always get stopped by neoliberals or conservatives when it comes to how are you going to pay for it? Where are you going to find the money? Who do you have to tax? What if they don't let us tax them? All this kind of stuff, right? We don't have to do that. On principle, do I want to tax capitalists? Yes, of course. 70, 80, 90%. I don't even think there should be billionaires. Like, that should be completely unallowed. But do we need their money in order to reach these goals? We don't. We don't need their money. We have the capacity, the United States in particular, has the capacity to use the power of the public purse and to use the monopoly that it has over the dollar to reach these goals. What we need to do is liberate fiscal space and resources in order to make these things happen, okay? So at some point, we might not have the labor to do that, we might not have the resources, so we might need to gather them from other places. So that's where we might need to think about regulating Wall Street more, not letting them speculate. raising taxes on certain people or on certain industries and practices to open up labor and open up space, right? But the point of departure shouldn't be thinking about where are we going to find the money. And the faster we can move away from that, the faster we can get on these goals that are absolutely of urgent importance. And then I'll end with this. Finally, a core part of the Green New Deal and of modern monetary theory is the idea of a federal jobs guarantee. As I said before, right now there's this thing called NAIRU, the Natural Accelerating Inflationary Rate of Unemployment. And it's this like really wonky thing that has been really popular since the 70s, since the neoliberal era. And it basically says that we can't have full employment because when unemployment goes down to a certain rate, inflation is going to get crazy, and so we can't do that. So there's this thing set at like 5% or 4% where unemployment is just normal. And whenever anybody gets scared at the Federal Reserve, they'll make policy to raise unemployment. So more people get unemployed, and that will stabilize prices. That's the status quo right now, and that's absolutely, insane and a bit sadistic. So what we propose is a federal jobs guarantee that substitutes unemployment as the anchor to prices and makes employment the anchor to prices. Okay, so we set a wage, whether it be $15 an hour or $20 an hour, whatever we think is politically just. We set that wage and we allow the government to offer jobs in the community, in the care economy, doing things that are low carbon intensive, doing things that are going to build healthy communities, recuperate what's been lost because of deindustrialization, because of all the mental health crisis, the need for tutoring, the need for childcare, the need for elderly care. All of these things can be taken care of by a federal jobs guarantee. It will be the anchor. It's something that Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for. So it's something that's both a human right and also stabilizing to the economy. And that will be kind of the core of it. And I think where the conversation can go from here is perhaps talking about intellectual property, copyrights, patents. We can't just give those up to corporations and private enterprises in the Green New Deal. We have to talk about rebuilding the commons, rethinking property rights. How can communities have ownership over the technologies that are going to develop with the Green New Deal, with all of these things? And also a movement for internationalization, a global Green New Deal, cleaning up supply chains so that if we're benefiting here, it's not at the cost of other countries who are getting exploited. So, thank you very much. Q&A, right.
All right, we're going to take a couple questions. So yeah, just raise your hand and I'll bring the mic over.
Hi, I'm an eco-socialist.
Yes.
I think that as Richard Smith pointed out, the basic contradiction between solving our climate crisis under capitalism is the nature of the capitalist system itself. The fact that it requires unending and expanding growth to survive. You're come here to tell us that there's a different solution, that modern monetary theory suggests that we can print money, pay for all this stuff, without having a class struggle, without mobilizing to seize the property, nationalize it, and put it under workers' control, and that we just don't have to, we can choose to tax the rich, or we can choose not to tax the rich. The urgency is such that we just don't really have to bother with some of these questions. And I'm glad you're here, and I was thrilled to hear your explanation of MMT, but I have to say I believe you're selling people a fairy tale, and that the way forward, in my view, is to mobilize working people on an unprecedented scale to take control of this country, to take control of production, and to run it on the basis of human need. To get a state to put money into the things that you're talking about requires that class struggle. It doesn't require a vote in Congress to use the theory of modern monetary theory to suddenly fund stuff and imagine that the labor theory of value just goes out the window. So I believe you're doing a disservice to the movement. If you want to build a real fight to stop climate change, it means mobilizing the working class in its most massive numbers to advance the class struggle, not to imagine that it can be suppressed. So I challenge you with your Keynesian ideas. They've been tried over and over and over again in the history of capitalism, and I don't think this one's any different. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. So I would respond to that by saying that I'm absolutely 100% for a class struggle. I don't think that there's anything I said that was against that. I mean, we should absolutely have a class struggle. And like I said before, we shouldn't have any billionaires in existence. They should be taxed out of existence. And I think anybody making hundreds of millions of dollars should be taxed at very high rates. Not because that's going to pay for anything, but because that's the right thing to do. And then in relation to the comments about modern monetary theory, it's already describing the way the system works, and I think that's something that gets lost. That's already how it works. When these politicians want to go to endless war, nobody talks about how to pay for it. They just do it. And nobody talks about how to pay for tax cuts. They just do it. And what I'm suggesting is that we just use the evolution, and this is something that Marx actually was starting to understand in the later volumes of Capital. All I'm suggesting is that we use this system that's already in place for the benefit of the public purpose and the public good for workers, so that we empower them, so that we don't have to depend on thinking that money and capital grows off rich people. It doesn't. So I think that this is actually a supplement and a collaboration to the class struggle. Thank you. Yeah.
Hi. I'd like to address this kind of exchange and your point about early on about electoral action and coming back to the original New Deal.
Yeah.
Because the New Deal of FDR was a great thing, although albeit had limitations and problems. But it came in response to a massive movement which was calling for much more radical things. A labor movement, unemployed movement, poor people's movement, and socialists and communists were involved, and there were many specific proposals which got some watered down version of, in the final New Deal. Now, it was better than the absence of it, but we have to keep in mind there shouldn't be a contradiction or between movements, radical movements, visions, and whatever bills get proposed in Congress. And I think I love AOC, and that was a lovely little video with Molly Crabapple, but the one thing I didn't like is that there was no mention of big movements, the labor movement or the social movements. It was about this cute little girl who then rises up and gets elected. I mean, that can play a role, but without the movement behind them, they can't do anything. Or they just adapt, There have been lots and lots of radical movements and politicians who've, just been absorbed by the Democratic Party. So I'm just wary of that.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I mean, there's nothing that we're going to accomplish that's going to be easy or that can be done without people mobilizing. Yeah, totally. Agreed. Also, just to talk about the New Deal, I mean, the New Deal had its huge limit. It was an incredibly important thing, but it also it was a racist set of policies in a lot of ways. It stabilized and created a middle class for most white Americans, but was fundamental to redlining and all this kind of stuff too, right? So that's something that we're trying to transcend in this iteration of the Green New Deal as well.
You proposed earlier replacing unemployment with employment as an anchor for prices.
Yes.
Is that something that Congress has the power to do, or is it the Fed or the President? Because I feel like the way you organize around that would differ depending on the answer.
The U.S. Congress essentially will pass the legislation and appropriate the funds to make that happen. I mean, the Federal Reserve will just make sure that none of the checks bounce because that's their job. But we can also change a lot of policies on what the Fed does, right? So one of the things that right now the Fed does is that whenever we do deficit spending, people misunderstand this as borrowing, where it sells treasury bonds to bondholders and gets money from it, right? really it's an asset swap because a treasury bond is just another form of money. So what they're doing is they're creating like a savings account with interest. So it's like a subsidy to bondholders. That's a bad policy. So one of the things that we advocate for is permanent zero interest rate policy to take away that subsidy from the rentier class. So there are many things that we can do to change the policies of the Federal Reserve and things like that, but ultimately this is a political decision that Congress can do with the right kind of pressure from social movements, absolutely. And I'll just add too that the federal jobs guarantee is funded by the federal government because they have the power to, but it's administered locally, which I think has a lot of relevance for this community and any community and it connects to the idea of social movements getting involved, right? Because in order to administer the federal jobs guarantee, you need groups that are on the ground, building relationships, mobilizing for the things that are needed in the community, and those are the jobs that are going to be offered. Those are the connections and the relationships and the networks that are going to be critical to this happening.
All right, great. We're going to take a couple more.
I think these ideas are wonderful, and thank you so much for presenting them all. There's something that I'd just like to mention. The economy is supposed to give us what we need physically to survive and thrive. The real economy is nature. Everything we get comes from nature. And there seems to be a disconnect between acknowledging that and allowing nature to do what it has to do to support us. It seems that any valid economy has to be based on valuing nature first and foremost, allowing it to have what it needs to regenerate, its resources, giving value to the biodiversity and to not polluting it and destroying it, because ultimately, whether it's climate change or extreme pollution or whatever that we are facing as a threat to our survival, it's because of us disconnecting from that basic fundamental connection. And I'd like to see any talk. I know there's a long way from where we are to where we're going. But I'd like to see a talk about the ultimate destination as being an economy that puts nature first and foremost, because that's the real economy.
Absolutely, I agree with you in that as well. I think that one of the main problems has been this economism, that we think that the only thing that the center of society is this thing that we call the economy, and everything else is kind of ignored as secondary or as having a function to support the economy, but not taking into consideration the real, environmental biodiversity limits, ecological limits that exist. One of the legacy of real existing communism is China, and they're becoming an environmental catastrophe in a lot of ways too. So, I definitely agree. I think we should. There's this book called Donut Economics, which I think is interesting, and it kind of says that the economy we should strive for should be below the limits of the environment that we should not surpass, but meeting the needs of society. So so it's like in the middle of the donut. We have social needs and we have environmental limits, and it should be in between that where we should be thinking about how to organize things.
Thank you very much for the Q&A.